So I'm currently reading through Rudolf Steiner's last great work, Karmic Relationships, which is a huge series of lectures that he gave in the last year of his life, 1924. He stopped lecturing by September 1924 and then dies in March of 1925 from an intestinal illness. But this lecture cycle is huge. It's something like 60 or 70 lectures that he gave all through 1924. So there's a lot of them. And they are all available in an 8-volume series, which you can buy online. But you can also go to the Rudolf Steiner archive, which is what I'm doing right now. They're all on there, and you can read through all of them in electronic form. Much cheaper to do that. And so I'm still on the first volume. I'm nearing completion of the first volume. And I thought I would go over the details of the past lives. What he does is he goes into the past lives of a number of famous and important European thinkers. And I find this very interesting to compare it with my recent researches into interviewing the dead using the medium Shruti Campbell and the results I'm getting there, and then tallying those results with what Rudolf Steiner had said. And it's interesting because I had originally read Rudolf Steiner kind of as a mythologist, the way one would sit down and read Tolkien as a Just So story. That's how I initially read him back in San Francisco when I was reading him in the early 2000s. And spent a year or two reading a bunch of his books. I no longer think that anymore. After my experiences using a medium to interview the dead, I now think that Steiner knew what he was talking about and that what he was saying was essentially true. A lot of it is in metaphoric picture, mythological language, but a lot of it isn't. A lot of it is very direct. Steiner came out, he was born in 1861 and he dies in 1925. So he comes out of the grand German philosophical tradition, even though he was a mystic, unlike all the rest of them, starting with Kant, who publishes the Critique of Pure Reason around 1789, 1790, something like that. And Kant inaugurates this whole epoch of German idealism, which Fichte then comes in. In Fichte's first book, everybody thought Kant wrote, because it was so similar in style to the Critique of Pure Reason. And so Fichte comes along after him, and then we get the group represented by Hegel and Schelling and Hölderlin. All three of them were roommates, and then they carry German idealism on into its apotheosis. All of this is very academic. All these guys were university professors, and then Schopenhauer comes along, and he's very different. He's the first, for example, not to believe in God as an ultimate transcendental signified. For Schopenhauer, he plugs the cosmic will, where God now occupies a semiotic vacancy by the time Schopenhauer comes along. And there's a certain way in which Schopenhauer changes everything to a game about ethics, about whether life is something that should be lived or whether it should not be. After him, we then begin to get figures like Edward von Hartman, appears with the philosophy of the unconscious. He's one of the first to begin talking about and using this term unconscious long before, several decades before Freud and Jung are doing it, with his book Philosophy of the Unconscious, published in 1869, which is even more pessimistic than Schopenhauer. And we'll get to one of von Hartmann's past lives here in a minute, as Steiner recounts it. And then we have Nietzsche coming in at the tail end of this development, starting in 1872 with the birth of tragedy, and then ending with his derangement into mental illness along about 1888. Something like that. I think he's about 44 when that happens. Steiner did meet him after he was deranged. He was becoming friends with Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, the sister of Nietzsche, who was trained to seduce him into editing all of Nietzsche's writings. Since Steiner had begun as a Goethe scholar, he came out of the university system. He went through university training. He read all these guys. He wanted to continue in their tradition. He didn't like academe much, I don't think. But he always had this side of him where, he knew, as a young man, he saw the ghost of a dead woman when he was sitting in a railway station waiting for a train. And the ghost of a dead woman came to him and said that she had committed suicide and that she wanted him to help her. So he'd had experiences like this all along, and so that he knew he wasn't just a high German intellectual, but he also had a mystical ability to see ghosts, communicate with the dead, and perceive the other side. A very rare and unique talent coupled with a super high German intellect. So he had been editing the writings of Goethe, and Nietzsche's sister wanted him to do the same thing for Nietzsche's archives. And so he went and had a glimpse of Nietzsche. He said, in this book, he writes of the encounter, which we'll get to in a bit. I won't spoil it. We'll get to that in a bit. But he met Nietzsche, saw him, when he was already deranged, decided that he didn't want to do that task, and then moved to Weimar, which didn't work out. He became an editor there for a bit, and then eventually to Berlin, and was eventually chased out of Berlin by the Nazis in 1922-23, much later on, when there was an attack on his life when he was giving a lecture, actually in Munich, a lecture in Munich in 1922, and people rushed the stage. Bombs were set off, stink bombs, I think they were, or smoke bombs, something like that. There was a huge ruckus and confusion, and Steiner just barely escaped by exiting out the back door. So the Nazis really wanted him out, and he was warning everybody what would happen if the Nazis got into power, that it would be a total disaster. And so he saw it coming. And so anyhow, he met Annie Besant with the Theosophical Society in the late 1890s, or right around the year 1900, and then he's invited to give lectures. And so for the first time, he leaves the world of respectable academe, where he's been a closet mystic all along, and then once he meets the Theosophical Society, he's about 40 years old, something like that, or close to it, then he comes out of the closet with his spirituality. Now he can address an audience that is receptive to his views about the afterlife, the other side, ghosts and spirits and angelic hierarchies and all that kind of thing. Now he's got a whole audience for it. So he lectures and lectures and lectures. From the age of 40 until he dies at the age of 64, he lectured almost every night. And then eventually he breaks with the Theosophical Society over the issue of Jiddu Krishnamurti, which Leadbeater had hailed. He had seen this kid, Jiddu Krishnamurti, on one of the beaches in India, and was going to present him as the reincarnation of Christ. Steiner rejected that idea because he had an idea that for him the Christ event was unique and involved the incarnation of the avatar of a sun god coming down to earth and actually changing the etheric vibratory structure of the earth by bleeding into it. That myth is central to Steiner's conception of his own unique, rather kind of Gnostic version of Christianity, and he wasn't about to concede this idea of this kid being the reincarnation of Christ. That didn't work for him. So he broke and formed what he called anthroposophy, rather than theosophy, anthroposophy, and then created his whole own unique audience in Germany, giving talks and lecturing and speaking and so forth for the rest of his life. And this man was quite a polymath. He was quite diverse. He created the Waldorf schools, which is a unique form of education that roots the individual in the arts and in mythology rather than in the sciences. And he had all kinds of ideas about medicine, anthroposophical medicine, how to treat the body, biodynamic farming and agriculture. An absolute universal genius this fellow was. So I think he's worth listening to. With intellect of this nature, this doesn't come along every day. This is once in a generation, this kind of intellect. And I think he's worth listening to. If he has ideas about the afterlife, they should be considered when they're coming from somebody of this high caliber of an intellect. So what I think we should do before moving into the karmic relationships proper is to discuss his main theory of the architecture of the subtle body, without which nothing else is comprehensible. I think you have to know this, and it's the first thing. And I would recommend don't start reading Steiner with the published writings like Theosophy, How to Know Higher Worlds, or An Outline of Esoteric Science. The written volumes that he wrote are not quite as good or as accessible as the lectures. Start with the lectures. You can dive in on any one of them, pick them up, and they'll seduce you right in if you're open to that kind of thing. And read the lectures. That's the best of Steiner. That's where he's at his most open to the audience. And in the published volumes, he's a little bit more guarded, I think. He's worried about a certain degree of respectability and being taken seriously in the published volumes. So all the stuff comes out in the lectures, though, and they're much easier reading. I recommend to people, too, who want to read Heidegger, don't start with Being in Time. You're going to get frustrated. Don't go anywhere near it. Start with the lectures. Read those lectures as they come up to Being in Time so that you can see the gradual unfolding of his thinking. So that by the time you get to something like The History of the Concept of Time, which is a lecture series that Heidegger gave that's basically the same content as Being in Time, but it's a totally different, much easier going experience. Same thing with Steiner. Start with the lectures. They're much better and easier. So as respects the architecture of the subtle body, the first thing Steiner says There are four aspects to the subtle body. And he says that the subtle body begins with the physical body. And the physical body, this thing that we're incarnate in, is the same thing that we have in common with the mineral world. The mineral world is the world of hard-formed matter, physical substances. And when we die and the soul leaves the body simply is left as holy space. Time is no longer a part of its metabolism, and it's just become physical matter. So that's what we have in common with the mineral world. But we also have something that the mineral world doesn't have, but that we have in common with plants, which is the etheric body. And the etheric body is what activates and animates the physical body, shot through with subtle energies and currents. These are probably the same thing that's manipulated with Chinese medicine, with acupuncture, acupressure, and so forth. And these currents are what maintain the physical body. And at death, the etheric and what he calls the astral body withdraw. But if the etheric body is still there, whether the astral body is there or not, it'll stay alive, which is what happens at night when you dream. Your astral body leaves the physical body, but the etheric body stays in it, which is why you stay alive, and the astral body goes on various journeys. So the astral body then is the next one. That's what we have in common with animals. Anything with a nervous system has an astral body. It's a higher level of conscious awareness than the dreamlike sleeping existence of plants. I suppose the mineral world would correspond to what in the Upanishads would be referred to as deep dreamless sleep. The plant world would correspond to what in the Upanishads is called dreaming consciousness, and the astral body would correspond more or less to waking consciousness. And then there's one more component that human beings have that nothing else in creation has, and that's this thing that he calls the ego. Now, by ego, Steiner does not mean the same thing that Jung and Freud mean, which for Freud it's simply the reality function or the I think. The ego for Steiner is this unit of individuality which transmigrates from one reincarnated lifetime to the next. So it's like a monad. It's closer almost to the Hindu conception of the jiva or the purusha that migrates from body to body to body, but it does carry your personality along with it and your karmic scars, what the Hindus call samskaras. They're carried along with it as you migrate from one lifetime to the next. So those are the four aspects of the subtle body: the ego, the astral body, the etheric body, and the physical body. And when you die, all three of those bodies withdraw from the physical body, and it's left behind to disintegrate into the mineral realm from whence it came. And then eventually the etheric body, which is tied in with memory in a very mysterious way. The etheric body has to do with memory. It's like Sheldrake's morphogenetic fields. It has to do with memory, and that carries you over into the afterlife. So the first experience you have when you get there is usually the life review. The etheric body opens up and unfolds because it contains all the memories of your life, these karmic scars from your life that unfolds before you panoramically. And Steiner said this way back in his writings long before I encountered the near-death experiencers on YouTube talking about this, and I realized Steiner said the same exact thing, that the etheric body unfolds and you have the life review. You see your life backwards, as it were, and you go back through it and see all the mistakes you made, what you could have done better, what more love you could have given here and there, and it helps you work out your next incarnation, and then the etheric body dissolves very quickly, and that dissolves and you're left with your ego together with the astral body. Then those go through various processes and dissolve, and then you're left with the ego that needs to rebuild a new life in conjunction with the aid of spiritual beings. Steiner uses the traditional hierarchy of 9 levels of the angelic beings. You can call them whatever you want. And the word angel is just a convention from Christian terminology. They're not necessarily angels. They're just higher beings. But he does use Saint Dionysius's names for the lower hierarchy, the angels, the archangels, and the archai as the lower 3, then the middle 3, the exougai, the dynamis, and the kyriotets, and then the higher hierarchy of the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones. All of these beings are involved in one way or another with helping you reconstruct an astral body, a new body that is constructed for your next incarnation. So, with all of that out of the way then, I suppose we should move to karmic relationships and get into some of these ideas. One other thing I should mention is he discusses in the first few chapters of karmic relationships this idea of the threefold nature of the physical body, where he says that the head is almost like a kind of primitive exoskeleton. And when you look at the developing embryo in the womb, it's basically all head, and everything else unfolds from it. The head in the womb is like a seed from out of which the rest of the organism just unfolds and sprouts with these appendages, the legs and arms that eventually separate. And you can see this, that the head basically is the seed from out of which the new body unfolds. But the head has to do with the realm of thinking and with the nerves and senses, whereas the central chest area has to do rather with feeling and with the circulation of the blood and the breath. When your breathing changes, your consciousness changes. If you get scared, your heart starts beating. That's all tied up with feeling. And then the third aspect are the motor limbs, the four limbs themselves, which are tied in with willing, with volition. And so we have thinking, feeling, and willing, and these three different components of the physical body that should be taken into account with some of the aspects of the following discussion. So what he does is, after he goes through all of this, he starts moving into specific case studies of the past lives of specific individuals. He starts off with this two obscure individuals that I won't go into because they're so obscure nobody knows who they were. Eugene Düring, who was a sort of science guy, a mathematics guy, and Friedrich Theodor Fischer, another guy. They're too obscure to discuss. I just don't know them. But Schubert is the first interesting one. The composer Franz Schubert. So he talks about the past lives of this composer named Franz Schubert, who was apparently always broke, never had a dime in his life, and but did have the good fortune to have a wealthy aristocrat friend of his named Baron von Spahn, with whom he was very close. And occasionally he would hang out and stay over at the Baron's house, spend the night, and the Baron would see him writing his little compositions out in the morning. He would tell people that Schubert would wake up and then just go right straight to writing his compositions. They were so effortless. It was as though they came out of his sleep. So von Spahn, it's a little bit like the relationship between Marx and Engels, where Marx was totally broke and Engels was always paying his bills. And by the way, we will go into the past lives and Marx and Engels coming up on another one of these discussions. So this relationship between Baron von Spahn providing and helping Schubert, and Schubert died penniless and nobody knew who he was. So his compositions weren't even discovered until after he died, and then all these posthumous compositions started coming forth and people started realizing how great he was. Now Steiner, in looking back into the past lives of these two individualities, realized that he went through it and he said that in around the 8th century AD in Spain, von Spahn was actually a prince of Castile who was chased out by the Moors, as the Moors had conquered Spain and were working on it at that time. And they chased him out. But Franz Schubert at that time, that individuality, which we call Schubert, was at that time one of the Moors. And he was a very wealthy Moor who actually was sympathetic to this Prince of Castile, von Spahn, who came to him, and Schubert provided for him and gave him aid and sustenance and sheltered him. So there's a relationship between this Christian Prince of Castile and this Moor, who were originally Schubert and Baron von Spahn, is what Steiner says their past lives were, so that later on, in accordance with the law of balance and compensation, which is one of the primary laws of reincarnation, balance. Karma, you could say, it's not really karma in the sense of punishment or retribution. It's balance. It's kind of like Jung's theory of the relationship between the unconscious and the conscious. They're always trying to compensate for each other's over-stressing. If you overstress one side of your thinking, your unconscious will pull back on the other way to try to attain homeostasis. We do the same thing across all these lifetimes. And so when these two guys reincarnated as Baron von Spahn and Schubert, then the favor was returned, and von Spahn took care of Schubert. So that's that life. Then he discusses the life of Friedrich Nietzsche. And so he says that when he went to visit Nietzsche and he saw him, it looked as though he looked very peaceful, lying there in his bed. It looked as though he had just had his morning breakfast and had been thinking about his philosophical thoughts, and he had this very peaceful look about him. But he says, but I could see him spiritually, and I could see, so Steiner has this kind of shamans have this ability too, this X-ray vision to see into the subtle energies. And he said that he saw Nietzsche there, his physical body and the etheric body there together, but that the nerves and senses system of the head had been totally destroyed, so that the astral body and the ego could no longer occupy it, but were on the other side, the astral body and the ego, connected to Nietzsche by a thin sort of tendril. So that's the situation that he saw of him etherically. So he wanted to know about Nietzsche's past lives, and he started thinking about Nietzsche having this anti-body tendency. Nietzsche wasn't really much into his body. Steiner says you get this sense from some of his writings, but you also have to think about the fact that he wrote a lot of these things while walking. He would take walks, very long walks, and he would actually write while walking. He just didn't have any real the body just didn't seem to matter to him. He suffered from all these migraine headaches. He was always ill with one thing or another. And he just had a very poor physical relationship with his body. And so Steiner went back into the Akashic record, I guess, and then saw into it and saw that Nietzsche actually in a past life had been a Franciscan monk. He had been a Franciscan monk who was very severe at doing penance, would bow on his knees all day long in prayer and injure his knees. And then he would take a whip and flagellate himself. And he would constantly cause his body pain through self-flagellation, this kind of masochistic infliction of pain. And Steiner says that the result of doing that to your body is that it ties the astral body much closer to the physical body, so that the astral body becomes sort of very realized, as it were, in the physical body. So that later when this individuality became Nietzsche, the opposite happened, and Nietzsche had a very loose relationship with the physical body, so loose that eventually the astral body separated from it and just sort of hung above it and hovered there. Very interesting. So that's the past life, the only past life that he gives of Nietzsche. Then he talks about Edward von Hartman. This one's a little harder to understand, but I still think it's worth recounting. Where he talks about Edward von Hartman, the author of the Philosophy of the Unconscious, which he put out in 1869, and that von Hartman had been a first lieutenant, a soldier in the Prussian army, and but that he had to retire. He was forced out of the army because he developed a debility in one of his knees. And the debility was so bad that he was bedridden a lot. He couldn't walk very much. So he did most of his philosophical work. He decided to become a philosopher as a result of being bedridden, wrote all his volumes while being bedridden. And Steiner thought that knee is interesting. He wanted to know about the affliction of that knee. And what he did was he went back into one of von Hartmann's past, and he saw that von Hartman was one of the Crusaders, let's say maybe around the year 1000 or 1100, something like that, who was involved with fighting this individuality. So he was a Christian crusader going to the east, who was involved in fighting one of these Muslims, who might have been a Turk. But the two of them had a previous past life before that, where the two had fought, and where the individuality that we refer to as Edward von Hartman at that time was a very witty, clever, insulting, acerbic, skeptical individual, and humiliated this other guy, who then later reincarnates as a Turk, and then von Hartman as a Christian. So the two are out on the battlefield in the desert, and the von Hartman individuality gets sunstroke. The sun is so bad that it actually shuts down his brain, and he loses the ability to think. Now, recall what we said about Steiner's model about the three different aspects of the body: the head system, the chest system, and motor system. Steiner says that there's a certain way in which the head system is connected with the motor system. The motor system of the limbs has to do with the will, volition, and the head has to do with thinking. But he says that if in one lifetime there's a damage of some sort to the head system, this will play out in a subsequent lifetime as a debility of the limbs. The two are interconnected in such a way that he says if you are lazy-minded in one incarnation, you're a slow, slothful type of person. In another incarnation, you're not going to be a fast runner. You're going to have a debility of the limbs. So the two are interconnected, and he realized that the sunstroke that caused Edward von Hartman as a crusader to shut down later resurfaced as this debility in his knee, to which he then resigned and became a philosopher. So then we get to this chapter, which is my favorite one so far. I like this one a lot, where he does the opposite. Instead of starting with contemporary individuals from his time and then tracing back their past lives, he goes back to some famous Islamic figures and traces what they end up becoming as they reincarnate later. And he starts with Harun al-Rashid. Harun al-Rashid is this great He's the great ruler at Baghdad, right around the year 800 AD. He's an exact contemporary of Charlemagne. So Charlemagne is over in Europe. Europe is just slowly beginning to wake up into what Spengler would call its pre-culture phase. Its intellect is barely a flicker. Charlemagne taught himself to write, only just barely. He brings in a bunch of scholars, but most of them aren't terribly, like Alcuin or Einhard. They're not terribly well read. They're not terribly learned. There aren't many texts available at that point. There's a kind of primitivism about what Charlemagne was doing at the time, starting the West back on its track out of the Dark Ages, but still primitive nonetheless. Whereas, as Spengler writes, Magian civilization, which is the Judeo-Christian Islamic civilization, at this time was already at its apogee. It was cosmopolitan. Under Harun al-Rashid, Baghdad had newly been built as the easternmost capital. The capital of Islam had shifted from Mecca and Medina to Damascus, and then over now to Baghdad, the furthest east of its extensions at that point by 800. And Harun al-Rashid presided over a famous court of opulence and lots of learning, erudition, art and sciences, mathematics. The Arabs were incredibly sophisticated. The West was nothing compared to them around the year 800. Incredibly sophisticated court of learning and culture and so forth that went on. And Steiner says that you have to remind yourself of what Islam was trying to do vis-a-vis the West. It was intent on gobbling up the West on two fronts. And so the southern front was the migration of the Arabs across North Africa to go up into Spain, which they did indeed conquer, but they were stopped in 732 by Charles Martel, the Frenchman, Charles the Hammerer, in 732, who stopped them. Otherwise, they would have gobbled up all of Europe. But they were stopped there, and they had to be content with owning Spain, basically, at that point. Fortunately so, because they brought all the texts of alchemy, all the texts of Aristotle, all kinds of scientific treatises, astrological treatises, and our Arabic numerals, which are much better than Roman numerals. All that stuff comes in when the Arabs conquer Spain. So it was actually quite beneficial for us at that point, given where the West was at its development. But the other flank was coming across from the Turks, going across, conquering Constantinople in 1453. They're at the gates of Vienna in 1680 or something like that. They keep trying to conquer Europe on its eastern flank, but they're stopped by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is designed specifically to function as Europe's eastern immune system and keep them out. Otherwise, Europe would have been Muslim, entirely devoured by Islam. So Steiner says, given this sense, imagine this in your mind, this attempt of Islam constantly trying to conquer and absorb the West, and then they're stopped, eventually on both fronts, by the French, and then later under Ferdinand and Isabella, who finally kicked them out of Spain. It's all taken back and so forth. What happens with this individuality named Harun al-Rashid is that when he dies, he reincarnates and enters the West as the philosopher Francis Bacon. Not the painter Francis Bacon, but the English philosopher Francis Bacon, who is the exact contemporary of Shakespeare, about 1600 AD. And Bacon is one of the first materialist philosophers. He's the guy who's famous for breaking down Aristotle's four causes. Formal and final causes, he says, are metaphysics. They're proper to metaphysics, whereas efficient and material causes are proper to physics. And so, in a certain sense, Steiner is suggesting that the influences, the attempt to conquer the West, since it didn't work on the physical plane, began to happen on the astral plane, with individualities from Islam reincarnating as Western scientists, who were mostly materialists. It sounds to me a little bit like he's saying that the Muslims are materialists. And they're not. He's not saying that, except for the Turks. The Turks they're like the Romans. They're the equivalent of the Romans and the Americans. They are pragmatists. They're not metaphysically inclined at all. But in a certain sense, it sounds like he's saying that, but I don't think he is. I think he's just talking about the attempt to penetrate the West with Arabism. And then he says, so looking at the life of this individual named Jebel al-Tariq, who in 711 AD led the attack on Spain for the first time. This is going back to 711 now. And this man was a warrior who was intent on entering into Europe via Spain from North Africa. And so we get the name, the Rock of Gibraltar is named after him, Jebel al-Tariq. And there was a battle there at that time, and they get a foothold, but that's all they get at that point. And he says this individuality, Jebel al-Tariq, later reincarnated as Charles Darwin. and the materialism of Charles Darwin somehow was a mirror or an effect of what happened with Jebel el-Tariq. That's as far as he could get, so they later reincarnate as Western scientists. Then he says, at the court of al-Mamun in Baghdad, 830 AD, who was a little bit later than Harun al-Rashid, al-Mamun, there was an obscure astrologer whose name we do not know, and Steiner doesn't know, but it was an obscure astrologer who was very learned and very looked up to. The Arabs had a superior knowledge of astrology. I think most of what we know from astrology was introduced to us by Arabic treatises. A number of the names of the constellations are carryovers from the Arabic. And so this individual was very learned in astronomy. And when he reincarnated as Laplace, the French astronomer, mathematician, who is famous for the quote about the silence of these infinite spaces terrifies me. But he was one of the great contributors to Kant-Laplace theory of the origins of the universe. Swirling itself into being out of a dust cloud comes from Laplace. But he was a materialist nonetheless, and so that's who that individuality was. And then he has this final thing about Muawiyah, who is the great ruler in Damascus. I believe he's the founder of the Umayyads in 680 AD, so he's just shortly after the first four great caliphs, who were the rulers who were immediately continuing after Muhammad. And then we get this individual who founds the Umayyad dynasty in Damascus, 680 thereabouts. And he doesn't say much about him, but he says that Muawiyah then later reincarnates as Woodrow Wilson. I kid you not. Woodrow Wilson, according to Rudolf Steiner, was originally Muawiyah. But he doesn't say anything further. It's like just a few sentences at the end of the chapter. He doesn't say what the connection is or what it is about Woodrow Wilson that carries that tendency on. So we'll stop there. Those are the first few chapters of karmic relationships, and I'm enjoying it very much. I find it very entertaining and thoughtful.